The film opens with Nicole Kidman's character, Grace Stewart, awakening from a frightening dream. The setting is Jersey in 1945, and her husband is still absent despite the war's end and his service in France. Grace resides in a large, eerie house with her 2 children, Anne and Nicholas, and has been left to manage the household alone since all of the staff left without notice or payment approximately 2 weeks prior. Grace posts an advertisement seeking new staff, and 3 individuals, including the silent Lydia, Elaine Cassidy, Mr. Tuttle, Eric Sykes, and Mrs. Bertha Mills, Fionnuala Flanagan, arrive at her doorstep to apply. Grace leads them on a tour of the residence, highlighting various rules that must be followed. For example, one must always shut the previous door before opening a new one, and the curtains should remain closed at all times because her children are photosensitive, developing rashes and sores when exposed to light stronger than candlelight. On a particular day, Grace checks the mailbox and discovers that the letters she had sent out to advertise the job openings remain unposted. She confronts Mrs. Mills, furious, and demands an explanation of how they knew about the vacancies if the ad had not yet been published. Mrs. Mills discloses that all 3 of them had previously lived in the house and loved it so much that they returned to see if they could be of any assistance, as a large home like Grace's always requires additional aid. Upon welcoming them, Grace had assumed they had responded to the advertisement, but they had not wanted to correct her. The house is no stranger to odd occurrences. At times, indistinct chatter, sobbing, and thumping noises emanate from vacant spaces, and converses with an unseen boy named Victor Alexander Vince, insisting that others roam the halls. Grace disbelieves her daughter and often chastises her for fibbing. However, Mrs. Mills comforts Anne, professing her belief in her stories and promising that Grace will eventually see the truth. Mrs. Mills then divulges that sometimes the realm of the living and that of the dead intertwine. Grace remains unconvinced until she hears thudding sounds coming from upstairs while sewing Anne's first communion veil. She rushes to investigate, only to discover no one present, but observes the door closing on its own in the mirror. Grace decides to launch an investigation to discover the culprits, enlisting her entire staff, the first of 2 or 3 such searches. She also seeks a priest to bless the house to rid it of any spiritual presence. Mrs. Mills urges Grace not to leave, but Grace disregards her advice and sets off. In her absence, Mrs. Mills confides in Mr. Tuttle, who is tending to the lawn, that the truth will eventually come to light and instructs him to conceal the grave markers located on the property. Eventually, Grace discovers her lost husband, Christopher Eccleston, who appears bewildered and disoriented, and brings him back to the house. However, he remains unresponsive and bedridden. Despite previously acknowledging the presence of intruders, Grace reverts to her obstinate nature. Her daughter shows her a drawing of Victor and his parents, including an unseen pianist father, Keith Allen, who played the piano one evening, and an old woman with sightless eyes. During one of Grace's searches for the intruders, she discovers a book of photographs depicting people posed as if asleep, until Mrs. Mills informs her that those people are dead and that the book is a volume of the deceased that superstitious individuals believed could safeguard the souls of the dead. Grace and her daughter are in the final stages of completing the communion dress when Grace departs momentarily. Upon returning, she is horrified to discover her daughter transformed into an eerie elderly woman, seated in the pristine garment. She seizes her daughter in a chokehold, screaming and striking her until the veil tears away, revealing Anne's tearful face. The child runs away, and Grace is left shaken, questioning her sanity. Returning to her husband's chamber, he informs her that Anne had divulged the previous week's events. Grace breaks down in tears, protesting that it wasn't her fault. However, he insists that he must depart, as he requires more than just Grace and their family. Despite Grace's insistence that the war is over, he remains adamant, claiming that he must return to it. He had emerged from the fog, bewildered and confused, and now he departs into it. The husband departs, and the following morning, Grace discovers that the curtains have vanished. The children scream, and Grace frantically interrogates her 3 servants about their whereabouts, even threatening them with a gun and ordering them to leave because they are not assisting her and have likely stolen the curtains. The children retire to bed, but eventually, they exit through the window in search of their missing father, as they are frightened of their mother. Grace ransacks the house in search of the curtains, inspecting the servants' quarters, where she discovers an envelope on a bed. Inside is a photograph inscribed with 1891, depicting Mr. Tuttle, Lydia, and Mrs. Mills, taken from the Book of the Dead. As the mist engulfs the island, and stumbles upon the gravestones of the 3 servants before spotting them in the distance. They pursue her and her brother, Nicholas, who race into the house with the servants in hot pursuit. Grace is present and barricades the door, instructing her children to hide while she confronts the intruders. Mrs. Mills informs Grace through the door that it is too late, and Grace must now seek out the truth herself. Meanwhile, Nicholas and Anne flee upstairs and conceal themselves in a wardrobe. However, the door flings open, revealing a white-haired woman with sightless eyes, Rinnie Asher's son. The sight causes everyone to scream, including Grace, who has by now rushed upstairs. The scene shifts to a gathering of individuals seated around a table, which includes the elderly woman who now acts as the seance's speaker. She queries the children as to why they are lingering in death. Ghostly Anne and Nicholas protest that they are not dead, while ghostly Grace snatches up papers and rips them apart, yelling and shaking the table in a bid to gain the speaker's attention. The camera then reveals that the papers are fluttering about on their own, and the table is quaking, but Grace and the children are not visible. The other participants observe the spectacle, watching the blind woman scribble frantically on a piece of paper during the frenzy. Eventually, the commotion subsides, and the old woman snaps out of her trance. The truth of the matter comes to light. Grace had suffocated her children in their sleep before shooting herself. The servants had vanished a week or 2 ago because their employer, Grace, had died. The house's present occupants are the pianist father, Keith Allen, mother, Michelle Fairley, and their child, Victor Marlish Alexander Vince. They ultimately leave the house due to the haunting presence of Grace and her children. The 3 servants perished during the TB epidemic 50 years prior, and yet everyone persists in residing in the house, the living coexisting with the dead. Grace eventually admits to the deed. However, the following morning, she awakens to discover her children playfully engaged in a pillow fight, causing her to believe that she has been given a second chance to be a good mother, as if her heinous actions were merely a nightmare. The film concludes with the current inhabitants unable to banish Grace and her children from the house, prompting them to depart as Grace observes from an upstairs window. The sign posted on the gate advertises the property as being for sale. Grace declares that she and her children will never abandon the house as they belong there.